Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab, all on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this exciting discussion, an important discussion about countering cyber fraud that is sponsored by CSIS. We have a really amazing panel to discuss this critically important topic. Just to give you a lay of how this conversation is going to go, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes. There is a mechanism for you all to send in questions. Please do so, and we will spend the last 15-20 minutes going through and asking and answering your questions as well. As I mentioned, we have a really amazing group of panelists to join us. I am going to give the very, very brief bios, the very brief kind of highlights of what their roles are, under the assumption that you would rather have us get right into the substance without spending a lot of time talking about the background. But we have Brian Rabbitt, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the U.S. Department of Justice Criminal Division. In that role, he supervises more than 600 prosecutors who investigate and prosecute crimes involving security fraud and money laundering, among other things. We have Matthew Noyes, who's the Cyber Policy Advisor for the U.S. Secret Service. And in this role, he leads development of strategy and policy, primarily as it relates to conduction of transnational cybercrime investigations to protect the U.S. financial sector and other critical systems. And last and certainly not least, we have Chip Ponce, who is the president and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network and is a senior advisor for the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy Center on Economic and Financial Power. Really couldn't be a better group to discuss this obviously important and timely topic. So I'm going to turn it to Brian first and just ask you to describe a little bit about the landscape of the frauds that you are seeing and that you're dealing with at the moment.
Thanks, Jen. Can you hear me? Great, thanks. First of all, I just want to say I appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Thank you to you, my fellow panelists, and CSIS for hosting this event. You know, the COVID pandemic has presented a lot of challenges. I think that's an understatement for ordinary folks and for the U.S. government as well. One of those challenges, of course, is an increase in criminal activity, unfortunately. That's something that we see, unfortunately, every time there's some sort of natural disaster. There's always those who would seek to profit instead of seeking to help. I think that's true here, but potentially even on a larger scale, given the breadth and scope of the ongoing pandemic. You know, as with any crisis, there is a lot of criminal activity that's going on. You know, we've been focused in particular in the criminal division of the Department of Justice on financial fraud. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today, and then also a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of online cyber activity as well. One of the things we've been particularly focused on is the CARES Act. I think you know, we all know from past experience, anytime the federal government seeks to distribute billions and billions of dollars, the opportunities for fraud are significant. So we identified that early on. The department and the criminal division took a leading role back in 2008 and 2009 with the TARP program and fraud relating to that. And we kind of recognized that as a potential model and built off of that. You know, I think folks are relatively familiar with the CARES Act, so I won't go into the details. One area where we've been really focused on is the Paycheck Protection Program, which, as you know, distributes or has the potential to distribute almost $60 billion in small forgivable loans to small businesses for payroll and other qualifying expenses. You know, we identified this as a potential source for fraud early on, and unfortunately, that is something that we've been seeing. We've charged approximately half a dozen cases across the country relating to that. I think what you're seeing and what we've been seeing is really traditional fraudulent tactics kind of applied to this program. So individuals falsifying documents, making false statements to lenders in order to obtain loans, and then making false statements about how they're spending the loans or how they intend to spend the loans. So that's something that we've been unfortunately seeing a lot of. We're focused on it. We're working with other U.S. government partners to identify it and, where appropriate, prosecute it. The department as a whole has also been focused on a number of other different areas, including hoarding and price gouging. The Attorney General early on in the pandemic set up a task force led by U.S. Attorney Craig Carpenito up in the District of New Jersey to focus on this. I think you've probably seen some public reporting about some of their activities, going after folks who are illegally hoarding and price gouging with respect to personal protective equipment and that sort of thing, seeking to capitalize inappropriately on the crisis. Returning to the criminal division, we're also focused, putting the CARES Act fraud to the side. Given the nature of the crisis, healthcare fraud is something that we also identified early on as a potential issue, and it's something that we're tracking closely. In that respect, we're focused on testing fraud. So what we've seen and what we're concerned about is telemarketers, online actors reaching out to individuals offering testing services for COVID-19 and other tests in order to obtain personally identifiable information that's then used for either identity theft, traditional identity theft, or potentially for submitting claims to Medicare and other health insurers for services that are either not needed or not prescribed or, in fact, never delivered. So again, healthcare fraud is something that we're watching as well. And then just talking about the online realm a little bit, a crisis like this always presents a number of opportunities. The department's been very focused on scam websites, so websites that are offering fake cures, fake treatments, that sort of thing, as well as business email compromise schemes and ransomware attacks.
All right, it looks like we lost Brian for a few moments, so I'm gonna turn it over to Matt and let Matt jump in here and talk a little bit about what you're seeing as well in terms of just putting it a little bit in perspective. What's the landscape you're seeing? What's new and different in the wake of COVID?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, and agree with everything Brian was saying. I think the Secret Service, we focus on the complex cyber-enabled frauds involved, and what we've seen over the last 20 years is the growth of transnational online cybercrime. And a global pandemic provides a unique opportunity for that. And so we're seeing criminal activity targeting Americans from overseas and also our foreign partners. But key to much of that, when it's profit motive, is it flows through the U.S. financial system. And so preserving the integrity and the trust of the U.S. financial system is our focus. And so we focus on the sophisticated, similar to our counterfeit mission, right? You can go after a simple counterfeit, or you can go after highly deceptive. And we want to ensure we're focused on the most sophisticated actors that are operating in this space. And so the landscape that Brian illustrated is exactly right from what we're seeing. And we're seeing some of the groups that have kind of long operated in cybercrime pivoting to this as their new opportunity, where they might have done IRS income tax refund fraud in past years. Now they're focused on economic impact payments or unemployment benefits or the various loan programs that are guaranteed by the U.S. government. Yeah, thank you.
And Chip, I'm going to give you a chance to weigh in as well. Just talking what you see as the biggest threats right now, and what we as a nation ought to be most focused on and most concerned about.
Thanks, Jen, and real pleasure to be back with CSIS with you and with Matt and with Brian, and feel as if I'm putting back on my public service hat. I was at the Department of Treasury for about a dozen years after 9/11, and had a great pleasure of working with the Justice Department and the Secret Service. So it's nice to be back. Completely agree with where Brian and Matt are, not surprisingly. Just taking a big step back, I think what is astounding here is the scale, the scope, and the urgency of what we're seeing. And those factors have dramatically accelerated, in my view, the risk environment that we're operating in. That risk environment, I think it's useful to take a step back and think about it as an intersection of fraud, our financial system, and the online space. And it's why having Brian and Matt here is so helpful, because at the end of the day, when you look at where we were before this crisis, we were already in an incredibly dynamic risk environment where fraud, the financial system, and online activity were converging. And a lot of that was around new technologies associated with financial services, the specialization of our financial system, and the ability to use those new technologies to detect and to track financial crime. When you look at the current environment, because of the scope of relief and the pace at which that relief is being distributed, it has just dramatically accelerated those opportunities for criminal networks to operate online, to operate in the global financial system. And that is all compounded by not only the economic crisis, but the underlying health crisis and the social distancing that goes with it. So you have more people online than ever before. You have more businesses converting to online forms of communication and operation by necessity out of social distancing. You have more dramatic changes to human behavior and their financial behavior as a result of these social disruptions, from the health crisis to the economic crisis. And so when you take that landscape over the last 3 months on the back of what's happened over the past generation, you have a dramatic shift in behaviors from again, individuals to businesses in the real economy and online and in the financial system. And against that changing picture, to try to assess where the risk is and distinguish changes in behavior that are legitimate, that are affecting tens of millions of American businesses and individuals, from those changes that signal risk, is really hard. And that's really what I think we're up against now.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. So great. So a question, I'm going to intersperse audience questions as we go along, but this is a question from the audience, and it dovetails with what I was planning to ask anyway, so it works out perfectly. But the question is about how much, there's been reports about activity from North Korea, from China, from Russia. How much of the activity, how much activity are you seeing that's being spearheaded and led by malicious foreign actors? And if you can figure it out, what is their motivation? What are they trying to do here? Is it economic gain? Is it geopolitical gain? What are we seeing, and what kind of steps can we take to deal with malicious foreign actors, and then as distinguished from domestic actors?
Yeah, absolutely. From our perspective, we've seen primarily financial motives. There are actors aligned with foreign states that have financial motives, but overwhelmingly it's transnational organized crime. There's certainly domestic components even in those schemes, right? They may need someone in the US to receive the payment and send it on to them. But when we see the sophisticated activity, it's predominantly transnational groups that have been engaged in cybercrime, identity theft, and related crimes for a long period of time, and are taking advantage of this opportunity. I think we'll have to wait for hindsight to get a statistical lay of the land. But in terms of sophistication, the strongest actors we see are located outside of the US in large part.
Brian, is that consistent with what you're seeing as well? And
yeah, it is.
Yeah, thank you. I had to switch devices here. I apologize for the technical difficulties. Yeah, look, I would agree with what Matt said. I think it's a mix as you kind of look across the landscape. Much of like the standard crime, so to speak, that we've been focused on in the criminal division relating to CARES Act fraud, of course, is mostly homegrown because it's mostly going to be U.S. businesses, U.S. borrowers borrowing those funds. In terms of internet-based criminal activity, I would definitely agree with Matt that the scam websites that we're seeing, the ransomware, the DDoS attacks, the phishing attempts, the attempts to kind of exfiltrate PII are frequently driven by transnational organized criminal organizations, groups that do this for a living, so to speak, but are kind of adapting to the crisis and using it as an opportunity. I will say that we have spoken publicly about some malicious foreign state actors as well in a couple of areas. I think the FBI recently released, I think, a fairly unusual public statement, and unusual because it's not something that they do lightly, relating to attempts by Chinese affiliated cyber actors to hack into U.S. companies, research institutions that are conducting COVID-related medical research as well as COVID-related vaccine research, and attempting to exfiltrate that data, whether that's for kind of geopolitical advantage or standard IP theft or a little bit of both in the current environment. I think remains to be seen. So completely agree with Matt. It's mostly transnational organized criminal organizations online, kind of running their familiar playbook, but I think there are a number of bad actors in the nation state space that are certainly attempting to capitalize on the current situation.
Chip, I just wanted to give you a chance to weigh in, and then I want to then turn to the evidence gathering questions that raises. I mean, as I think many of you know, I and Matt and many others have spent, and all of us have spent time thinking and talking about the challenges that we face dealing with evidence gathering, particularly when it involves evidence that crosses borders and working with partners across international borders. So wondering how those challenges are playing out in the current moment, and what is working and what's not working, to the extent that you can talk about ongoing investigations, obviously in a broad way without revealing any information about particular cases.
Jen, thanks. Obviously, I'm not involved in any of the government investigations, although from my tenure at Treasury, I will say that with respect to the question of foreign actors and what Matt and Brian have said, which dovetails, certainly is consistent with what we saw post 9/11 through basically the financial crisis from the Treasury Department. And it led, interestingly, to, from the Treasury perspective, the addition of new authorities to combat that convergence of transnational organized crime and nation states operating online. And when you look at the executive orders that were issued to raise the threat of transnational organized crime to a national security level with respect to the strategy and the sanctions programs that were unveiled in 2011, there was a big part of it was understanding that escalation of threat was very real. And then the convergence of that with respect to nation states online, we saw in the evolution of the cyber EOs that happened in 2013, I believe. I've got that right, and then was amended subsequently to expand the targeting criteria to include transactional criminal groups that may be operating with nation states in the online space, international conflict online. And so everything from espionage to misinformation to theft, right? Those executive orders really marked, from my tenure, the rapid recognition that the evolution of the online space, the financial system, and nation state actors and transnational organized crime was becoming a dominant national security threat. And obviously Matt and Brian are seeing that face to face now. With respect to international cooperation, I'll just say this, fully agree that when we look at the lessons going back 2 generations post 9/11 about the evolution of the international financial system and not only the real economy that relies on it, but whether it's terrorism or organized crime that also relies on the rails of the global financial system, everything local is global, and anybody worth chasing is cross-border. That was a truism that was just more and more evident over the past 20 years, and it meant if we did not have a cross-border approach to going after transnational organized crime, online disruptive, online malicious activity, fraud, or other forms of financial crime, we weren't going to get there. And so the good news is I think we have, as a country and as a global community, set in place an extraordinary framework for international cooperation with respect to financial crime, built on the back of anti-money laundering, but really expanding across national security threats. That framework is alive and well, notwithstanding what I think the politics are, no matter what your politics are, and the headlines and the challenges of diplomacy. There is a real professionalism in that environment. We continue to deal with that environment at K2 Intelligence Financial Integrity Network with respect to our clients. We have a lot of banks that are operating cross-border. They are collaborating with the authorities and the jurisdictions in which they operate. They are collaborating cross-border with respect to information they have about risks that are hitting their enterprise in different countries and different branches. But those challenges remain very real, right? Especially with respect to real-time information sharing. And last point is simply, when you do a post-game analysis on all this, as Matt has suggested, we'll get a lot more data. And still early on, we're learning a lot, I'm sure, in the public sector and the private sector for sure, that's right. The challenge with some of this fraud is that if you don't get it in 24 to 48 hours, it's gone. And you can reconstruct it, and that's a big part of the record-keeping systems that we put in place, but it's often gone if you're not on it quickly. And the way that our system has traditionally been set up has been to be a bit more reactive rather than proactive and systemic. And that's the pivot that I think we're really challenged to try to execute now.
So Matt, I'm gonna turn it back to you. That it's encouraging to hear that the cooperation is alive and well and continuing amidst a lot of chaos in the world. Curious as to hear your perspective on that, as working in the trenches, and also of course, there's always room for improvement. So where are the improvements that we can focus on and think about in this regard?
Yeah, building on what Chip said, the good news is the financial system nexus. So unlike some of the challenges we see with digital evidence and the internet ecosystem, is you have a maturity in the financial system in terms of records retention and cooperation, because they recognize the shared interest of preserving the integrity of financial payment systems. And so there's a shared common interest between public and private entities. And so when you have crimes that are related to the financial system, you have that kind of strong basis of evidence and cooperation globally to go after it. So whether it's from the fraudulent loan application perspective or fraudulent transfers, we have seen cases where apparently legitimate applications to some of these loan programs have had their account credentials stolen and then the money taken from them that way. And so there's an interplay there. And the good news is the financial system, by its nature, overcomes some of the challenges we see in other spaces. But certainly those other challenges still exist. The PII is kind of stolen independent of the financial system and then used fraudulently in the financial system. And so you still have some of the similar challenges. The 24/7 preservation is key in terms of achieving justice, but it's the pace that tends to be more of the challenge of some prosecutions can happen very quickly, and DOJ and U.S. Attorney's offices have been very good about doing those quickly. But others, when they involve evidence stored in foreign countries, it takes time to bring that evidence back to the U.S. And bring those cases. And so it's that time piece that is the key for us to shorten. And so I think the where to improve is that public-private partnership, the private actors choosing to ensure that key records and evidence that may indicate criminal activity is preserved and is obtainable through lawful process. And then from a law enforcement perspective, there's also an interesting challenge when it comes to internet crimes or crimes involving digital evidence, is that you often deal with a volume of data that requires new analytic and investigative methods. And so being able to bring together those data sets, combining data sets across multiple sources, to then be able to identify the trends, the indicators that provide the leads for further investigation is a key piece. And that is predominantly a technical challenge. There's certainly legal dimensions to that as well. But how do we ensure our people are well positioned to conduct those sorts of investigations that involve terabytes, petabytes of digital evidence to identify the criminal activity in a wide sweep of information.
And when you and obviously, as you start talking about bringing together data sets across different entities and areas, and obviously that in and of itself raises a whole host of security and privacy considerations as well.
Indeed. I mean, and so the bulk of that relies on public information or business records as opposed to particularly sensitive information. And so you're looking at aggregated transfer information, whether it's publicly on a blockchain ledger, and then linking that to other activity. Not talking about kind of intrinsically sensitive privacy data that's been obtained through court process in most cases.
Brian, I'm going to give you a chance to weigh in here as well on what you see as the good news and what you see as kind of the challenges ahead. And when I bring in, I think many of you have been, or some of you may have been following some of the work out of an organization called Third Way that's been talking a lot about the mismatch between the number of cybercrimes that occur and the relatively small numbers of prosecution. Now, there's a myriad of different reasons why that's the case, but wondered if you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, I think it's primarily a product of a detection and evidence gathering challenge that is inherent, I think, in any kind of cyber case. It's self-evident that unlike a local property crime, anytime somebody's reaching in and conducting cybercrime and taking PII and putting it into a transnational criminal organization and taking it overseas, there's going to be problems inherent in tracking that, in identifying who's responsible, obtaining the evidence, building a case. Those things are complicated to track and they take time. That's certainly something that's only been complicated by the ongoing pandemic. I think Matt talked a lot about kind of informal information sharing among law enforcement entities and the private sector. That's obviously really key, and that's something that helps move cases like this along, particularly in the pandemic environment. One issue we've had, just kind of moving back to DOJ and away from the front lines. Typically when you want to get information from a foreign partner through a more formalized process that could then be used in court, we rely frequently on mutual legal assistance treaties or other evidence sharing agreements. Obviously, that cooperation has continued during the pandemic to the fullest extent possible. But there are certainly challenges where we're not in the office, or our partners in Europe or elsewhere around the globe are not in the office either. That's led to delays. We're still making progress. We're still advancing our cases. But as with everything else during the pandemic, there are kind of challenges that we've got to overcome with respect to that. And to echo something Matt said, we are relying quite a bit, both domestically and internationally, on private sector partners. I was speaking to an anti-money laundering group a couple of weeks ago, talking with them about ways that they could share information so that they could understand exactly what it is we're looking at, what we're looking for, how they could work with us in a timely and effective fashion to identify and get us on the trail of, so to speak, exactly the kind of crime you're talking about. So we're relying on all of that in this environment to try to make some progress as quickly as possible. But there are always challenges, and those challenges are magnified in the current environment.
So both just on that question of public-private partnerships, what are there authority gaps that need to be dealt with that would facilitate public-private information sharing? Are some of the challenges? Is it a trust challenge? Is it a access to classification challenge? What do you see as the biggest challenges and hurdles, and where? I mean, there's obviously been a huge amount of success as well. So, what are the lessons learned from the successes?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think it's not necessarily a trust challenge or a authority challenge, although there's always additional authorities that can be provided. There's always improvements that can be made in the law as we move forward. One thing I've been struck with since coming into this job and in dealing with the pandemic has been the importance of relationships and communication. I have found that financial institutions, by and large, are very willing to cooperate, and technology companies as well, very, very willing to be helpful where they feel they can. But they want to know exactly what it is that we're looking at, what the landscape looks like, what we're focused on, what we're seeing. And then conversely, it's very helpful for law enforcement, for us at DOJ, to understand what they're seeing, what's going on their platforms. It's critical that we have a picture of that so that we can kind of understand the threat landscape. Taking this to kind of using the example of the financial system, suspicious activity reports, SARs, are critical. And we rely on those, in the money laundering context and the financial crimes context to detect both individual crimes and criminal transactions, as well as to kind of spot broader trends. But I think, as everybody can probably guess, in the current environment, getting a SAR written and filed, and then having it percolate up through the Treasury Department and then make it over to a law enforcement organization or to DOJ is something that can take some time. And as several of us have been talking about today, when we're dealing with cybercrime moves quickly. Often the PII is gone, the information is gone, the money is gone by the time we can kind of get on the scene and start doing our work. So one of the things we've been emphasizing in terms of our cooperation and our communications with the financial industry is communication and relationship building. So if you do spot a suspicious transaction, of course, file a SAR, take the time you need to write it up and get it into the system, but also pick up the phone. Call Matt and his colleagues at the Secret Service. Call somebody that you have a relationship with at the FBI. Let them know what you're seeing. Let them know what you're going to be filing, so that we can kind of get a head start on tracking the criminal activity and investigating before the SAR comes and it's potentially stale. We might be able to get into an account and freeze it, stop further transfers of money, return it to either the government or to a business or an individual that's lost that money. So relationships, communication, and timely communication are really key, particularly in this environment, in my experience.
I want to remind the audience members to please send questions as you have them. We are here to answer your questions as well. Matt, it sounds like you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. You made the point. I mean, both Third Way and then also Track at Syracuse University have kind of focused on that capacity. And white collar federal prosecutions in the U.S. are down 30% compared to 10 years ago and 40% compared to 20 years ago. I wish that was because there's less crime, but I don't think that's the case. And so I'm a computer engineering background. From an engineering perspective, when you have a challenge like that, you either improve the efficiency of the resources you have, or you increase the resources. And the access to evidence becomes the key piece of how we improve the efficiency of the limited capacity. We have focused on this challenge of complex cyber-enabled fraud. From my perspective, there's the Bank Secrecy Act and Electronic Communications Privacy Act, ECPA and BSA. Those are kind of the two key pieces that constrain and also enable our partners in this space. And they have some differences in terms of how they're structured and go about it. And I think that the key thing for us in the early stages of investigation is, one, preventing the fraudulent assets from being cashed out of the financial system, right? And so to do that, we determine that it is a fraudulent transaction. And when it involves internet communications, we need to be identifying the subscribers to those accounts. And so we're not talking about the content of internet communications, just understanding the metadata portion and the subscriber information in a rapid fashion. And 2702C, it restricts generally voluntary sharing of that information unless there's life or bodily injury at stake. And in a fraud case, that's rarely the case, maybe on the fringe with a fraudulent test kit or treatment aspect, but generally it's not the case. And so how do we voluntarily work with providers to identify who's involved in a communication that might be defrauding someone, so that we can then freeze the assets, becomes the key question. And on the financial side, it's kind of, you have that robust cooperation with the financial fraud investigators to identify the financial account subscribers and sort that out. On the internet, the communication side, you don't have that. And so that is where we see the greatest challenge in being able to move with speed and effectiveness to be able to stop fraudulent payments and return those to the victims of fraud, is that voluntary cooperation to identify subscribers in cases that don't involve life or bodily injury.
Chip, you're nodding.
Hey, Jenna.
I want to give you a chance to chime in as well.
There, I'm unmuted. Thanks. I love this topic because I do think it is way overdue for serious examination, which is public-private partnerships. I had mentioned at the opening that before we entered this crisis, we already had a bit of a crisis on the issues that Matt's talking about, and the way that we were overcoming the challenges to investigation, prosecution, disruption, and prevention of serious organized crime, including online, and ultimately through the financial system, was through relationships, as Brian was talking about. It was just crucial to have core relationships with our money center banks, with law enforcement, the intel community, interagency, public-private sector, et cetera. But it's not enough. There have been scads of hearings going into 2020 on Bank Secrecy Act reform, on the need for clarity and aggression on how we deal with privacy and legitimate data protection interests, and balance those with the need for speed to track and trace a growing and more complex threat that operates in the global financial system and the underlying real economy, from fraudsters to nation states. That reform conversation was accelerating even before the crisis. And what I'll say is just a few words about what it is that we're trying to achieve as a country and a community around public-private partnership, what we need to make it work, and why it hasn't happened. What we want to do in terms of objectives is we want to pivot from this transactional, reactive, case-led approach to protecting the integrity of the financial system to a proactive, systemic, real-time capability. And we have the technology to do that. There have been pilots that have been talked about. Some are operational, some are notional, but about sharing bulk information in ways that can be encrypted to protect PII, but to detect threats as they're happening. There have been discussions and pilots in some places to embed our bank's best analysts with the best investigators and analysts on the public sector side. Imagine putting our biggest banks, their best teams, and former law enforcement investigators and analysts together with our best task forces on the public sector side, and sharing information to go after whatever organization we're going to talk about. That's something that we need to be racing towards, and we haven't been able to get there because, in many respects, I do think there are authority gaps, there are resource limitations, and there is a trust factor. when you're a financial institution, and we see this all the time on both sides in our firm with governments we're working with and with financial institutions, that a financial institution wants the security of knowing that if I'm going to be cooperating in that kind of proactive systemic way, I don't want, if we find leads, which is what we hope to find, and it comes back to my institution, which is inevitable if we're going to find leads, I don't want to get in trouble for having had that actor or that activity or that network in my bank in the first place. So can you give me assurance, government, that that's okay? And the government understandably says, well, we can't give you a safe harbor because you're just going to dump all your information in front of us and say that you don't have a responsibility. And both sides are right, but we've got to get past those talking points and into something that gives banks assurances and confidence that they can participate in these sorts of aggressive pilots without feeling as a general counsel or as a fiduciary matter that they are putting their institution at risk, and at the same time have maintained the responsibility to protect the integrity of their institution independent of these pilots. That's a very real conversation and set of challenges that I'm not sure we've been able to get by. If we get there, then we will have the ability to respond urgently to frauds that we need 48 hours and then it's gone, and systemically, where we are filing SARs and we are investigating, and we're doing this in a combined partnership fashion that's real time. That's the dream, and I think this crisis may accelerate some of that work. I'm hoping that's a silver lining out of it.
Great, thanks. I also thanks for that, and I want to kind of pick up again on something that Matt had pivoted to, which is we spent a lot of time talking about the financial industry and the challenges and the opportunities and the suggestion that there's potentially new ways forward. But I want to go back to this question of cooperation with social media companies and the non-financial industry sector, and ask one, how critical is that cooperation? I mean, can you do this alone with just the kind of financial system cooperation? How much do you need the social media companies? And for Matt, you talked about the restrictions under particular parts of ECBA 2702 with sharing with the government, but that section does not prohibit private sector to private sector sharing. And is there any discussion or opportunities for there to be kind of sharing of information between social media companies and the banks in the way that can kind of get at a whole of private sector response approach?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple, there's numerous efforts, and I'm not picking favorites, but just to name one is NCFTA, National Computer or Cyber Fraud Task Force out of Pittsburgh. They now have an office in New York and I believe LA or maybe San Francisco. I forget which is their West Coast option. But that's the exact consideration there of how can industry and cross-sector work together on these shared interests. And I apologize for that drilling in the background. And so we do see some solid cooperation there. I think there's room to extend and expand that. But law enforcement also brings something important to the table of we see the criminal trends, we have the undercover access, we have the abilities to identify what's coming more than just what industry can see alone or even sharing their information. And so being a participant in that becomes a key piece. And like most relationships, if all the lawyers are involved, it's probably not a very strong relationship. And so they certainly have an important role, and we want to ensure everything is cooperative. But some of the industry partners, feel constrained in what they can voluntarily cooperate with on information that is with government, with law enforcement, which has very minimal privacy considerations when you're not talking about the content of communications. And so ensuring that cooperation can occur becomes a key thing. And oftentimes we're reassuring, industry partners are looking for reassurance that they're complying with law. And I would say CSIPs within the criminal division has done a great job of kind of providing that guidance and communication to help people understand the law and the landscape. I believe back in April, or maybe it was March. They published some information on private industry, online investigative activities to help them understand kind of what is readily allowable in that space. And so sometimes it's just an understanding gap of understanding what the actual constraints are. But there are some where I think there is a reasonable question of, is there an authorities change that would be appropriate to enable appropriate cooperation?
Brian, some of Matt's comments, bring to mind a report that I'd worked on under CSIS's auspices with Will Carter and Will Crumpler. Will Crumpler's on the phone right now, about some of the challenges that law enforcement faced in accessing and analyzing digital evidence, and in particular, while, as Matt just mentioned, CSIPs obviously has some of the best minds in the field and incredibly experienced prosecutors working with technologists and doing extraordinary work. What we found in this report is we talked to federal law enforcement and prosecutors and some of the tech companies across the country that there's huge gaps in knowledge and expertise and training in the ability to use and even just figure out where to go to access digital evidence. And then once the evidence is returned, if it is returned, being able to interpret that evidence and use it in a useful way. From where you sit, how much of a problem is that currently? And what, if anything, do you think can be done to address that particular aspect of the problem?
Sure. Now, look, I think it's a very good question to be asking, and it's a very timely thing to be considering. I mean, across all types of criminal activity that we're interested in and that we're pursuing at the Department of Justice, digital evidence is becoming increasingly common, from the most straightforward bank fraud cases to the most sophisticated hacking and data theft cases. Digital evidence plays a role. And I do think you're right that we can always be better. We can always be improving our understanding of current technologies, our handling of and best practices for digital evidence, particularly given how dynamic digital evidence is and how dynamic technology is. It's always changing. And so I think there is a need to have lawyers who, most of whom, myself included, are not particularly tech savvy, as you can tell from my inability to operate Zoom. As well as investigators, to have them kind of trained up on the most recent technology, on best practices. I think this is going to become an increasing issue for us as more and more cases become tech reliant. I also want to go back to something you mentioned earlier in terms of the timing of these cases and how long it takes to investigate them. A number of folks have touched on encryption and the challenges that presents. Particularly end-to-end encryption. And so when we're talking about cases like this, sophisticated international schemes, often we can get access to financial evidence, but when it comes to communications, end-to-end encryption is frankly a bit of a game changer for us, and it's a real challenge. And I do think it's going to present obstacles to us going forward that, to a certain extent, may be insurmountable in certain areas unless we can kind of come up with a tech fix that allows law enforcement to have lawful access to certain kinds of communications that will enable us to detect and investigate and hopefully prosecute some of this type of criminal activity. So it's all kind of a piece. Training's definitely a big part of it, and it's something that we're definitely focused on going forward.
I want to turn to a couple of audience questions. There is a question about cyber-enabled, whether or not any of you have observed cyber-enabled fraud schemes that were AI-enabled. So are you seeing the artificial intelligence used in connection with fraud schemes related to COVID-19? Is that anything that you're encountering or coming across?
So what is AI is an interesting question on its own, right? we have encountered the use of some criminal using very sophisticated, I would say, computational or machine learning techniques to help engage in fraud. Now, whether or not those techniques are AI is, as a computer scientist, I perhaps get overly focused on. But that is not the case in most circumstances. In most circumstances, it's hacking, it's compromised credentials to obtain PII or information that they can then use in fraudulent applications or fraudulent transfers. That's the vast majority of it, is really around compromised credentials. And so whether I pay close attention to the AI machine learning and that sophistication on the computational side aspect going forward in crime. It's just, it is not showing up in the data yet of what we're seeing. It's compromised credentials is the biggest thing. And so using multi-factor authentication is the most important security recommendation I can give anyone for any kind of sensitive system, whether it's their bank, an online banking, or their email, whatever the case may be.
So another question from an audience member about who should people report problems to when they come across a problem? Where do they go? Where do ordinary people go to report cybercrime, cyber fraud, theft of PII?
So Jen, go ahead, Matt. Sorry, no, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a number of options. There's state and local law enforcement. You get option Secret Service. You can go to secretservice.gov. You can look up our field offices. You can call or email them. Our partners at FBI, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3. We receive all the IC3 reports and go through those. You can also report to FTC. They do a great job in this space, but have a different role. But I want to emphasize, if you've been defrauded, if there's a fraudulent transfer that's occurred, speed matters. You need to get to law enforcement really within 24 hours so we can work with the financial institutions, freeze those funds, and ensure they're recovered. If we're contacted within 24 hours, we're highly successful at recovering those funds. And already in this pandemic, we've done that on the tunes of hundreds of millions in aggregate of when we're notified, we can get those funds frozen and returned to the victim of the fraud. But they have to move quickly in contacting us in that.
Jen, I would echo everything Matt said in terms of moving quickly, as well as the IC3 platform at the FBI is a great resource, particularly for cyber-related criminal activity. I'll just also put a plug in quickly for the NCDF, the National Center for Disaster Fraud, down in Baton Rouge. It's an arm of the department's criminal division. It's typically used for disasters like hurricanes, for the public to report disaster fraud. We made a decision early on to kind of plus out that operation down there and to build out a capability to take and screen all sorts of pandemic-related complaints from the general public. We've had almost 40,000 contacts since the pandemic began, and we've received 8,000 actual complaints of criminal activity. Now, not all of that's coming to federal law enforcement agencies like Matt's Secret Service or the FBI or the department. What we're doing there is triaging it. Some of it, as Matt points out, needs to go to state and local authorities. Some of it needs to go to the FBI or the Secret Service. Some of it needs to go to the FTC. Some of it's just stuff that we really can't do much about. But we're really relying heavily on the NCDF to triage complaints from the public. You can go to the website. You can submit complaints online. You can call and talk to a real live person and explain to them what's going on. So in addition to the IC3 platform, I would encourage the general public to contact the NCDF. And then as Matt points out, in terms of speed, if there's something that's happened that needs to be acted on quickly, you can always call your local FBI field office
or Secret Service field office or other law enforcement, federal law enforcement organization to get things moving as quickly as possible.
Yeah, Chip.
Yeah, just to add, in addition, for any individual or business, get in touch with your bank ASAP because of everything that Brian and Matt just said. Speed on fraud is critical. 24 to 48 hours. I mean, you gotta get to the bank to suspend transactions, to basically stop payments from being executed and settled. Things can be ordered and they're not actually processed yet. Once it's gone, it's a completely different ballgame. And unfortunately, the way that our AML systems are set up, it's really ex post. So you have the detection of suspicious activity, you have the reporting of that, and it takes time. And so by the time those risks are identified and end up at law enforcement through traditional AML channels, money's way gone. So in addition to everything Brian and Matt said about making sure you get to law enforcement, get to your bank ASAP and tell them, look, we got a problem, so that they can freeze the picture to the fullest extent possible in partnership with law enforcement. And they will often need your consent to do it. So just getting to the bank is call number one in my book.
So we only have a couple of minutes left. I want to give Matt a moment just to talk about something that I know that the Secret Service has been saying is important to them, which is moving their kind of home from DHS to Treasury, and just wanted to give you a second to explain why that's deemed important and how that relates to this particular conversation as well.
Yeah, so I think this administration looked at the responsibilities of DHS, of Treasury, and of Secret Service, and came to the conclusion that Secret Service could best perform its integrated mission if returned to its original location in Treasury. And so, again, as we've highlighted here, the partnerships with the financial sector are essential. We haven't spoken as much, but the various inspectors general, whether that's Treasury, OIG, TIGDA, and the FinCEN when it comes to the Bank Secrecy Act and the SARS was mentioned. And so having that integrated approach at Treasury of the criminal law enforcement capabilities of Secret Service and our global footprint of 161 offices, working alongside, integrated with Treasury, who has both the critical infrastructure sector specific responsibility for the financial system, but also a lot of the regulatory functions and relationships with the financial institutions. And so from my work and my perspective, that's the key benefit. Treasury remains a key partner. DHS will certainly continue to be a great partner for your return to Treasury. But that close alignment with the financial sector really provides opportunities for us to focus on and be most effective in the work and the subject we're talking about here today.
Great. Well, I want to thank Brian. I want to thank Matt. I want to thank Chip for the work that you're doing for an incredibly important conversation. Chip, you want to say something quickly?
I was just waiting, but I was foot stomping your applause for Brian and Matt because they're out there doing the work. And all my former colleagues in government to just say thank you, because I know you guys are straining like crazy, and appreciate all the work you're doing.
Well, and thanks to all of you for taking your time out of your busy days at home, but still incredibly crazy busy. And so thank you for joining us, and thanks to the audience members for coming, and thanks to CSIS for hosting this very useful and important conversation. Thank you.